Good afternoon. Welcome back again. We continue with our discussion on training and development. Just before we took a break, we had a discussion about the 4 stages of training and development. And I was talking about the need assessment stage and the design stage. So let's go back once again to the design stage, where we were talking about learning styles and learning principles. Now, why do we need to understand the philosophy of learning styles? In any training program, people do not learn in a similar fashion. My learning would be very different. The speed of learning or the style of learning for me could be very different from your learning style. Engineers could learn in a different way compared to doctors. The commerce students would learn very different from literature students. So you do have differences in terms of how do people learn, how do they grasp, how do they interpret, how do they retain, and what kind of skills that they or the knowledge that they retain. So I'm going to take a very brief revisit to some of the learning styles and the learning principles that you are familiar with. These are some of the organizational behavior subject issues. First task is, our first understanding that one needs to have is, learning is a self-activity. You cannot force anybody to really learn something. You can force the person to sit and read, but may not be able to really learn out of it. What's the idea of bringing this particular principle here? You need to conduct a training session with a great degree of involvement of people. If you were to do only a lecture kind of a method, the effectiveness of training program would be lower compared to involved activity. So which means a self-directed activity in a training program would be much more effective in learning objectives. The second principle that you need to have or an idea is, we learn at different rates. Some of us learn with mathematics or with numbers, numericals, facts and figures. Some of us learn by logical deduction of information. Some of us learn faster with abstract information. Some of us learn with diagrams and sketches. Some of us learn by case studies or examples or anecdotes. Some of us learn by the difference in terms of age. If a younger person is giving you a lecture, perhaps he would not be very effective. An older person giving may be more effective. So each one of us have different rate at which we learn, rate at which we retain the memory, retain the learning. We learn best by doing. There is a principle that you retain a greater amount of information or knowledge by actually exercising or practicing it or putting it in practice. Therefore, one of this the importance of this point is, whenever you have a training program, allow individuals to carry out some of their own activities so that they are in a position to appreciate what they have gone through, and therefore they would be able to understand what's good in them, what's not so good in them, what are their deficiencies, what are their strengths. So one of the idea is to allow participants to learn by exercising, by practicing, by interacting, by relating, by discussing. So those are the important elements in learning principles. The next issue is about positive reinforcement enhances learning. If somebody asks me a question and I say an excellent question had been asked, then that elevates the level of an individual's involvement, because unless you praise, you may not necessarily like a question, but you need not rebuke the person. You need not say that your question is not that bright. It doesn't matter. Remember, the first point here is, every individual has different levels of comprehending what's your own understanding. Do not presume that your level of knowledge is what the participants know. In a training situation, remember, most of the people who come in a training program are adults or people who have had a certain work experience. Their work experience is not complemented as much as by your theoretical expertise. Optimizing these two skills, that is, the participants have a greater work-related experience, you as academicians may have a greater conceptual clarity. If you need to have an optimal learning situation, you will have to have a better marriage between these two, experience and the conceptual clarity. If you are not able to communicate that way, then you would have, or you would disassociate the participants from what you are wanting to communicate. So, positive reinforcement. How do you do positive reinforcement? By saying, Sabash, excellent question, or your what do you think is your own answer for that. So, let individuals kind of conceptualize, comprehend, think, deduct. Maybe they could do inducting too. So, but allow the participants to come up with their own possible solutions. An excellent trainer is a person who has more of an intervention role rather than preaching role. He tends to facilitate learning rather than preaching or giving the learning material. The last point in any learning is there are several principles of learning, and I have just taken only 5 of them to illustrate. Remember, every person has an anxiety to what if my learning does not match up with my competence, or what if I am going to be asked certain questions for which I have no answer. Remember, in every training program, or for that matter, even if it is a lecture mode method of conducting a training program, you need to be very careful about when do you want to allow a question to be raised. If I am giving a lecture and somebody raises a finger and say that I want to ask a question, you might say that let me finish my point, or let me give you an opportunity after I finish my lecture. Then what happens is, at that point of time onwards, the individual starts reflecting upon, if I ask this question, will people look at me strangely? If I ask this question, will it sound too naive or too illiterate? If I ask this question, will people laugh at me? If I ask this question, would it sound very, elementary? So the individual starts thinking within himself instead of listening. So as a result, at the end of the lecture, if you allow that person to ask a question, by the time you would have already given an answer to that question that he has in mind. So one of the better way of engaging people is to take time off. Maybe you give 3 or 4 minutes of a speech, ask question, allow any clarification, and then proceed further. Therefore, recapitulation of whatever you say is an important a way of getting your participants along with you. So we are looking at what are the principles of learning. I'm going to take the next stage, which is about how do you treat the participants in a training program who are considered, whom we call it as adults, as learners. There is a difference between what is considered as pedagogy and what is called as andragogy. Pedagogy is what you see in a classical classroom situation in an educational institution. A teacher-centric learning. Teacher knows everything, he is communicating, and the student is learning, and he is supposed to only clarify, ask questions. So there is a hierarchy in terms of a teacher resumes a higher level of position, and the student takes a lower level of position. The relationship is student-teacher. In an andragogical situation, which is a training situation, the trainer becomes a facilitator, whereas the so-called student becomes a participant. So participant or learner, whichever language that you might call it as, but the hierarchy is not so so much as compared to a pedagogical situation. Most of the trainees, when they come into a training situation, would like to know why should they learn something? What is there for them after learning? If they come into the training program, will they gain something? Even if they gain something, will it be possible for them to put it in practice? Even if they put it in practice, will they be able to get recognition for their work or performance from the company? Even if they get a recognition, will they be rewarded? Even if they are rewarded, will the reward be good enough as per their expectation? So there is a series of calculation every trainee, conducts himself, or goes through himself. What is there for me to learn this? It's possible that you might have a very interesting situation, or a very interesting case study, or an example, or a role play. But an individual must be able to understand, okay, I have this role play, and it's a very interesting role play, but what happens after I leave this room? Will I be able to use what I learned at my workplace? And even if I put it in practice, what is there to me to gain from that? The second point of andragogy is each trainee wants to be self-directing in his own learning. Remember that. Therefore, whenever you prepare a training module, especially a booklet, you need to give sufficient space for an individual to practice. It could be in the form of one-liner question, or it could be yes, no kind of a question, or it could be an exercise for the person to complete. So an individual can pace himself or herself in terms of how much time to spend for a particular module or a particular training package, or a particular syllabi. The third point here is every trainee would become ready to learn only when they experience a need to know, or by learning that they would be able to do something better. I read it again, or I put it across to you once again. Every trainee will become ready to learn only if they are in a position to appreciate that by learning this, I will be doing much better work. So at one point of time, the person must be able to feel that I need to learn. For example, you might be doing, let's say, computing work, and suddenly your internet or your browser or maybe your own computer goes wrong. Similarly, when you are driving a car, maybe the car stops. At that point of time, you would be wishing, I wish I learned something about how to fix this browser problem, how to fix this computer problem, how to fix this system problem, or I wish I knew how to fix this car. I wish I learned from the mechanic how do I really take care of my car at a different point of time. So at that point of time, you are ready to be willing to learn something. So every participant also has a very similar kind of a desire to learn at different times, certain desire to learn. If you are able to capture that moment that a person is in dire need to learn something, the person becomes an excellent trainee. The next issue is about every person wants to relate. This is one of the first points that I mentioned about every person wants to relate that the training must lead to better performance, and the better performance must lead to good rewards, and the rewards must be sufficient enough for the person to feel satisfied. Remember, if any one of them is missing or any one of them is zero, that I learn something, I put it into practice. If I put it into practice, I will be able to succeed. If I succeed, that means if I perform, I should be recognized and rewarded. If the rewards are pittance, then I will lose the entire sequence of motivation. So you need to have that understanding as a trainer. Do the training program lead to an individual's improvement in his own stature, either in terms of career progression, or in terms of better performance, or in terms of better rewards? Let's look at this next stage of our discussion, which is about why do people find it very difficult to learn during the training program. First is, very often the training program is perceived as a waste of time. Why is it considered as a waste of time? Perhaps an individual may have gone through a similar training program in the past, may have come back from the training program and would have tried to implement something, may not have got an encouragement from either the organization or from the supervisors or from certain circumstances. So he would or she would consider the training program as a waste of time. Such sarcasm would lead to a greater degree of kind of a barrier or a kind of a wall around you to learn something new. The second possible reasons why people may not learn during the training program is, or may not learn to include it in the part of their own skill level, is the time between learning and doing. It's possible that whatever you learned may have had a passive decay. For example, many of you perhaps have gone through certain language courses during your schooling or maybe in your graduation. But maybe you learned French, or maybe you learned German, or maybe you learned Spanish, or some language you may have learned. Right now you may remember bits and pieces of those. But if you have been using it, maybe frequently, if not on a day-to-day basis, but if you have been using or reading some material related to the language that you learned, perhaps today you might know more than few words. So there is a passive decay if you learn something and you don't practice it immediately. So this is what we call it as passive decay. The training and the doing part, the training and the implementation part need to have a much more closer time gap rather than a long time gap. The next issue why people may not learn faster or learn and internalize is a lack of system support. Very often people may be sarcastically commented upon, oh, he went to a training program, now he wants to show off. Or you come back and do a very good job and your boss says, well, this is not sufficient. Or you come back from a training program, you do very well, and your boss says or your supervisor says, well, this is what you were supposed to be doing, so what's the big deal? Or you do very well, your boss also appreciates a great deal, but then you don't get any kind of a better performance rating or incentives such as bonus or desirable place of posting or promotion. Then next time around when you go to a training program, you will say that it is of no use. My company doesn't really bother. Whatever I learned, it's of no use to them or no use to me either. The last point about why do people have a problem related to learning is, what's the trainee's own personality and comfort zones. Sometimes the personality of a person may not allow, what is there for me to learn? I have worked for 20 years in this company. Why should I learn now? Whatever the learning that I have done, it's all over. I am now considered as an expert in this area, so why should I be really subjecting myself to a new training program? Who are these people to tell me? So that's a second type of a personality problem. The third kind of personality problem is, I am elder to the guy who is giving me the training program. He has to learn more than me, so why should I learn from somebody who is not as experienced as I am? The next type of a barrier could be that the training material contained so much of a numerical, so much of facts and figures. I was so confused. I don't understand these numbers and formulas. Please give me something which I can comprehend. So sometimes people may not learn because they are not comfortable in learning a particular way in which the training module has been prepared. That's what I said, that engineers learn at a different pace compared to doctors. Maybe the commerce students may learn it at a different pace than compared to literature students. So you do have different levels of comprehending certain kind of a knowledge. Different people have different way of learning. So these are some of the barriers to learning. Now friends, I just to kind of summarize what I was trying to give you, or what I was trying to talk about in the last 15 minutes or so. The reason why principles of learning is important is to design an appropriate training module, including the written material. When you are conducting a training program, do not presume that the trainees are students. Do not subject them to the same conditions as a classroom teacher would subject their students. So training situation is much different from a pedagogical or a classroom situation. And the third element is why or how to avoid any barrier during the training program in terms of intruding it in your participants' learning. That means, how do you optimize the learning during the training sessions? If you understand what are the barriers, you would be able to be sensitive enough to avoid such kind of barriers coming in between your training sessions. To be a successful trainer, you have to have a clearer understanding of how people learn, why do elders or why do people at a different stage learn at a different way or a different technique, and what are the barriers to learning. Now let's go to the next stage of our discussion, which is about the training versus learning. In recent years, there is a great deal of emphasis is given about learning is more important than training. You know, the learning organization as a concept has come in to catch up so vividly in a great number of places. People now talk about organizational knowledge management. How do you retain the learning that had occurred? For example, if I had worked in a project which may have been a very complex project, if I work for a consulting company and there is a project that came in and I was the first one to handle that project, and no other consulting company had been able to do that kind of a work, and our consulting company is the first one to do that kind of a work, if tomorrow the leader of the project resigns or moves away, do you lose the entire, the knowledge repository that had been with him or with her along with that person? Or should the organization try documenting the learning or disseminating across the team, or trying to document the experiences at different stages so that the next stage of people who come in to take that position could be able to transition into that position at a much easier manner. So if you were to make the distinction between training and learning, training is more on the skill based, whereas learning is more to do with the competency based. Training is invariably designed by human resource department, whereas learning occurs across all spectrum of the staff in the organization. Training could be conducted both on-site and off-site, whereas learning can occur anywhere. You don't have to have a particular place to learn any particular kind of a skill. Training programs are generally scheduled within a particular time frame, whereas learning can occur anytime but in real time, that you learn it mostly during the stage at which you are implementing certain kind of an activity. Training is more of a knowledge delivery, whereas learning is creating, sharing, documenting, and creating a repository of that. So these are the major distinctions between training and learning, though I have touched upon this as a more of a sketchy manner rather than taking it in a much more elaborate manner. I come back to the next stage, which is about training method or implementing the training. There are several training methods which are available. What are the training methods? You can use lecture methods, you can use case study workshops, you can use seminars, you can use outdoor activities like mountaineering or camping or group techniques, etc. You can even use something like under the tree or in a club or in a social gathering, or there are several ways that you can bring people together and make them learn certain things. Why do you need to use different techniques for different kind of a training program? Remember, not all training methods would be very effective as a training method. Not a singular method is very effective for all kinds of skills that you want to communicate. For acquiring practical skills, on-job training, OJT, which is mentioned here, field level training, on-the-job training would be more useful. Unless otherwise I operate a machine, how would I be able to really understand the technicalities of operating the machine? So therefore, I would have to have this practical exposure to that particular machine. If I need to know how do I interrelate, whether it is my interpersonal skill, whether it is conflict resolution, whether it is my leadership ability, whether it is my communication skill, etc., unless otherwise I am put into certain kind of a role play, games or exercises, etc., I may not be able to learn this particular trait or this particular skill. If I need to change the attitude, for example, there are a bunch of people who have constantly quarreled with one another. What would be the best way to really get these people together? I was reading one of the anecdotes about some of the companies, what they do. For example, there are several companies which send their newly hired employees for places like Haridwar or Rishikesh for river rafting, or to some of the mountaineering or jungle survival exercises. Why do they do that? Because remember, the new employees, new recruits are from different background, different educational institution, different kind of tastes and perceptions. When they come into the organization, they come with their own perceptions, attitude, aspirations or objectives. It's not easy for an organization to make them gel together. The easiest way to make them to gel together is by putting them into a condition where they would have to gel together. This is what we call in popular management term as a pressure cooker atmosphere. Give them a kind of a task which makes them to cling for each other's support. For example, if you had seen a river rafting boat, you will see that each member in that particular group has an important role to play. If one member doesn't play his role, the other members are in jeopardy, including the member himself. So therefore, each one of the support is very essential. So when you put the people into that pressure cooker kind of an atmosphere, then people cling together. It's like cooking a rice in the pressure cooker where the grains are kind of clinging together. So when each other require one another's support, you will have a greater cohesiveness. And that's what group techniques are all about. How do you change the attitude from conflict-ridden team to a very cohesive team? So one of the way to bring about a change like that is to take them away from the workplace, put them in a pressure cooker kind of an atmosphere, and give them deadline after deadline, put them under extreme stressful kind of a condition. They would have to cling together for each other to support one another. The next type of training objective could be problem solving. For example, you have a decision to take. You have to maybe turn around a company. Maybe there are certain stakeholders or shareholders who are highly unsatisfied with your strategy. So in such kind of a circumstances, what decision would be very important or very useful? How do you get this kind of an exercise or this kind of a skill acquired by an individual? Case study method. For example, you take a case study, something like a case of special economic zones, acquiring land for your own organization to expand. For example, a case study like maybe what's happening in West Bengal today could be an excellent example of how do you really strategize, how do you make people to have a larger stakeholders consultation before you move in for such kind of a strategy. So such kind of a case studies would be very useful for giving problem solving skills. The next kind of training program could be to improve an individual skill. If I have a subordinate, may not be several subordinates, but a couple of subordinates who are not capable of matching to the performance of other colleagues of them, how do I really bring them on board? Training may not be. Training in a common situation, in a classroom situation, may not be the right approach. So I may have to call them. I may have to tell them that I want you to do this work by 5 o'clock today. So what happens? You go stage by stage, an approach to coaching that individual. Remember the contingency model of leadership. If your subordinates are not capable of doing certain activities, and if they are not also motivated enough, the first task for you is to give them a level of motivation and then slowly turn them around. How do you turn them around? Not by giving a very huge task. Give them smaller tasks, tell them what to do, point out what are the things that is required for them to do, give them very directional kind of an approach, perhaps correct them whenever they go wrong. So almost every stage they need to be corrected, so that the moment they learn, then they also start showing interest in what they do. The last part is, if you want your employees to learn a great deal from what's happening around the world, what's happening to your industry sector, what is all about, let's say, SWOT analysis. For example, you want to conduct a workshop on, or conduct some kind of a session on some of the strategizing or ABC analysis or SWOT analysis. You could conduct workshops, lecture methods, conferences. These are some of the popular way of giving people knowledge acquisition, conceptual skills. So I go back once again to summarize what this particular, what I have been trying to mention to you. Remember, no singular training method would fulfill all kinds of skills that individuals need to learn. Classroom lectures would address knowledge acquisition. But if you want people to acquire hands-on kind of a skill, you cannot put them in the classroom and give them lectures. You need to allow them to practice themselves vis-a-vis the mission that they need to work upon. If you want people to change their behavior or attitude or towards their own interpersonal skills, then you may have to allow them to experiment their relational skills with one another in a simulated condition. Maybe you need to conduct intense small group workshops. So group techniques would be much more useful. So this is what I tried to mention, that whatever is your implementation of training, the methods that you may use for implementing the training, remember, not a singular method would be effective for all kinds of skills that you want to possess. To continue with this particular discussion about what's the most effective method of training, you will see in this hierarchy or pyramid of learning or effectiveness of the training program. Remember, the percentages given in parentheses is how much the participants retain whatever you have taught them. I use a word taught within quote. Lecture methods make the participants to retain only 5% or around that, approximately 5% of whatever they learned. Ask them to give them lecture as well as ask them to read. That's why whenever you give them PowerPoint slides, when you give them lecture along with a bullet list of points, their learning becomes double the effective, more effective, in the sense they are in a position to learn and retain up to about 10%, they are able to retain 10% of knowledge that you have given them. If you use PowerPoint slides like this, or maybe video clips, or maybe pictures, etc., they would be able to retain 20% of what you communicated to them. But if you demonstrate whatever you want to communicate, for example, right now, if I were to demonstrate how do I prepare PowerPoint, I go to, let's say, the Office PowerPoint presentation, and I create the entire slide and give you the visuals, etc., then it's possible for you to retain 35% of it. Group discussion, that's why very often training programs have brainstorms. You adjourn individual small groups and ask them to discuss, debate, come up with solutions, and ask them to present their viewpoints, etc., makes people to retain 50% of what they learn. Hands-on practice, on the other hand, that is, if you are using a machine, you are taught to use a machine, and you are allowed to do a trial and error in that, then you retain 75% of what you learned. And the last point, which may not be very visible in this particular visual monitor, is if you start teaching others, apart from all the methods like lecture and all that methods, the most the effective method of training would be if you allow the participants to teach others, or allow them to use immediately whatever they learned. Or, for example, you tell them that when you are communicating with your customers, these are the words that you need to use, and these are the words that you should not use. And ask them to speak again within a short period of time and point out, you did that mistake. So the person becomes conscious, and he may not be able to repeat that. So the effectiveness of such kind of a training is very immediate. So this is what we call it as training effectiveness pyramid, and you will see that this is based on some research that had been done in terms of how effective certain training programs are in comparison to others. We come to the last point of our discussion, which is about how do you evaluate training programs. The most common method of evaluating a training program is to get a feedback from the participants. The feedback is you prepare a list of questions and ask them to rate on the point of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, etc. Least effective, more effective, very good and very poor, well done, poorly done, etc. Now, what do you ask in these questions? The questions that you invariably ask is the content, the communication style, the effectiveness of delivery, the learning, the food or the arrangements, the accommodation, the learning material. So what happens is, invariably, you will find the participants, if they are very forthright, they might say not so good, average, etc. But most often, participants tend to say that the program was excellent, 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 excellent. So you don't get the real picture of what did they learn, what did they gain from the program. You took their feedback about how the program was, not what the program gave them, what the program equipped them with. So the second stage of evaluation should be not only how much they appreciated the program, which is the reaction. The second stage is what did they learn from the program. Very often you could conduct certain small tests. For example, you could give them kind of a singular questions, such as objective questions. If your customer is very irritable or irritated with the way you are explaining the product, what would be your reaction? So you give them the option. Did they respond according to what you told them? For example, if the customer wants to immediately be attended to, if you are not in a position to attend to immediately, what are the excuses that you will give, or what are the explanation that you will give? You can give them the multiple options and ask them what would be the most ideal option. So some of these could be in the learning stage. So Apart from reactions, you can also ask people what did they learn from the training program. The third level of understanding or trying to identify the training evaluation or evaluating the training effectiveness is, are they using what did they learn? Whatever they learned, are they trying to put them in their workplace scenario? If they are trying to put them in their workplace scenario, how would you know that they are doing it? Maybe the supervisor's report, maybe the performance evaluation report, maybe that they are actually using it and the customers are reporting it. So you do have some indicators which can measure whether the training has been effective in their implementation or during their day-to-day functioning. The last one and the most critical one is obviously whether they are using the training that they learned or whatever learning that they have done, whether they are putting it into practice, and whether their performance now is much better than what they were earlier, whether their productivity is much better than what they were earlier. For example, you go to a computer skills workshop or maybe internet or maybe browsing skills workshop. You are trained well. Imagine your reaction was, the program was excellent. What did you learn? Yes, I learned this is how you can do the search, this is how you can go into different kind of browsers or use different types of URLs, etc. Do you use those skills? If somebody asks you a question, yes, I sit in front of the monitor all the time. You sit in front of the monitor for what? Well, I am browsing all over the internet space, but I am not doing the job that I have been assigned. If that is the ultimate result of your training program, obviously the training program has not been very effective. So some of these have to be understood in terms of what's the objective of your training program, whether your objectives have been kept in specific measurable manner, whether your evaluation is feeding into the comparability. This is what I set out to really achieve in the objective, and these are my outcomes. Maybe it would take 6 months from now, maybe it would take 1 year from now, but at the end of it, you know this is what you set out for and this is what you have been able to accomplish. And the last part in this is, how do people learn to internalize their training? Very often people, when they come into the training program, they don't know that they don't possess the skill. First task of a trainer is to make an individual to feel that yes, they do not or they have no idea about the skill on which they came to attend the training program. That's the first success story of a trainer. Do you make the trainee conscious that they are not competent enough? The next stage of effectiveness in your training program is make an individual consciously competent. And the last stage is the subconscious level to which the person becomes competent. One of the best examples for this is if you went for driving, let's say a four-wheeler, let's say a car. You perhaps sat next to your friend when you did not know how to drive, and you would have thought, what's the big deal? All that I need to do is to catch the steering wheel and perhaps put the gear and start driving. But till you sit in the driver's seat, you don't become conscious that you do not know what exactly is the way that you drive. And then when you become conscious about your own competence, you start looking at where are the brakes, where is the clutch, where is the accelerator. So you make a conscious effort to know all those three pedals. And then when you become very competent, you automatically do that. So these are the 4 stages in which individuals become competent and learn from their training programs. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, maybe you could ask now. If you don't, perhaps you could leave the question at a later juncture. Thank you very much.